It's time to talk Cincinnati Bengals football. And when we do that, that means we summon CincyJungle.com deputy manager, the one and only John Sheeran. How's it going, John?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great, Greg.
Oh, we have to start all over again now, John. Come on. That was such a good open.
A little rusty.
That's okay. How's it go? So it's going great. Excellent. Glad to hear it. I know one short of a Super Bowl this time. That would have been even greater. But look, the AFC is just so freaking tough. Hey, come on, Sean Payton. Why don't you join the AFC while you're at it? It's just amazing. But look, I mean, I guess the fans know when you have a quarterback like you guys have, it's just a matter of time.
Pretty much. Like when you meet the Chiefs consistently, like you're going to go back and forth. Like usually they're the ones on the dominating end, right? But now it's 3-1 in the series, I guess if you want to call it, in the last 14 months. But every year is different. So it was 1-1 this year against, again, a really tough Chiefs squad who managed to be more efficient and more consistent on offense without one of the best receivers, because that's just how special Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid are. And good luck to Eric Bieniemy as he tries to get a head coaching job and to get away from the Kansas City Chiefs, because that makes a lot of sense for some reason. But yeah, another great year for the Bengals. 8 wins in a row after being 4-4 and not really knowing what they were offensively. They had a lot of issues to work out with the offensive line in terms of cohesion and everything. And once they kind of figured out what they could do from a run game standpoint with that offensive line, they started getting some stability and consistency, which kind of lacked in 2021. But so they just had to compensate for teams taking away the explosive part of their offense, and they had to just be more methodical with moving the ball, and they ended up winning the most games, or at least tie for the most games in franchise history for it.
What do you I know it's let's get offensive line out of the way, and we're going to have time to talk about everything, of course, but just quick observation. What else is missing? A key piece that's missing if the offensive line is fixed. Anything?
I think we kind of saw what happened when this offense doesn't have that third receiver that they can lean on. Like Tyler Boyd went down in the AFC title game, and obviously Bengals compared to a lot of other teams, embarrassment of riches, right? No teams have the combination of T. Higgins and Jamar Chase on the outside, right? And they still had really good games despite the absence of Tyler Boyd. But when they needed that third guy to step up, when the offensive line was kind of failing, like you saw the limitations of the offense. And when everyone's healthy, the offense can compete with anyone, right? So I think more depth from a skill position player standpoint. Obviously, you want better production for your buck at the running back position as well. And there's a conversation to be had with Joe Mixon and how to kind of manage that position going forward. I want to look at the defense too. Like there's obviously some marginal things that they could upgrade, but that unit's pretty solid, and they have their defensive coordinator coming back, and they might miss a couple of pieces this offseason, but they have guys waiting in the wings to replace some of those guys. So I don't expect that much of a drop off there defensively. And they've never been that much of a dominating unit, but they just get the job done because they have so much chemistry built with all each other, and they're just solid on all three levels. So I think just bolstering depth at some really important positions outside of the offensive line, it just helps them to keep whatever they have going.
Was there, for the fans, look, anytime you're an up-and-coming team and you reach the Super Bowl, the next year you want to win the Super Bowl. So the team didn't get there. So what was again, besides blaming everything on the offensive line, was there something else that the fan base was a little bit upset or disappointed at?
I mean, yeah, like the offensive line obviously took the lion's share of that just because of all the injuries. But I think there was some issues throughout the season with who steps up as the third pass rusher, and then Joseph Asai kind of assumed that role as he got more acclimated with everything. But obviously the run game, I think throughout the season was a sign of frustration, even though they had probably that 8-week stretch where they were really high in success rate. They were really high in terms of EPA per rush because they just found their little niche with what they could do and how to balance that with the passing game as well, how to marry both sides of the offense kind of together. So they had some success with that, but it took a long time for them to get to that point. I think there was definitely some frustration with the coaching staff, knowing that teams are going to play you more too high to try to take away some of those vertical routes that Chase and Higgins do so well. And the fact that you knew about this entire offseason, offensive line issues be damned. There should have been there shouldn't have been that long of a waiting period to try to figure out what is going on. How can we fix this? How can we remedy this on the fly? There should have been probably a better plan in place this past offseason to try to get over those speed bumps instead of waiting 6 to 8 weeks to finally find some cohesion.
Okay. I tell you what, first of all, you talked about Anarumo coming back. So as a fan, that's always a sigh of relief when you know you have a good coordinator, especially on defense, because you have Zach, so what his, you know how he's tied in overall to the quarterback. So not losing Anarumo had to be a big sigh of relief.
Pretty more so because you just don't know where that replacement's coming. Like normally in years past, at least under Marvin Lewis's tenure, there would always be replacements in-house that they could just kind of rely on, and sometimes it wouldn't always work. Like Paul Gunther never was quite the coordinator that Mike Zimmer was when Zimmer left for Minnesota. They had Hugh Jackson waiting after Jay Gruden, and eventually both of them went on to become head coaches. So if Anarumo had left, he has such this unique grasp on defensive scheme and command, and just building just an entire unit that is like moldable based off of week to week. It's the most flexible scheme and unit that I can think of in the modern day of the NFL. And I don't know how you replace that, at least in one offseason. I don't know if you can emulate that with someone coming from outside the organization. So there was just a lot of unknown regarding what's life going to be like after Anarumo leaves. But yeah, like when he returned, like there was obviously a sigh of relief with not only the fans but the players too, because the scheme has allowed a bunch of players, even really good players outside of the scheme, like DJ Reader, Trey Hendrickson, like they could be good wherever in the NFL, but the scheme has really elevated players from star levels to just spot starters who are just finding their role in the scheme, and they've all kind of thrived in it. So having that continuity there, you know what type of players that he and the front office likes to target, so it makes projecting, at least from the offseason perspective, a lot easier.
Okay, now let's go over the team. It's early, but free agency will be here in a few weeks, and that's why we've enjoyed having you on the last few years, especially around draft time or right after the draft, especially that time period. So can't wait to have that discussion too. But taking a look at, matter of fact, we had our first mock draft, and we have like 3 more, and it's an early one. The mock drafts before free agency are just kind of, well, let's just see what things kind of look like, but they're going to change dramatically. I looked at the Bengals, and I actually had the Bengals pick, and I looked at the Bengals, and I kind of check marked. Obviously, the defensive backfield is going to be the big mystery with free agency, but because I wasn't sure about what was going on there, I was all right. Maybe cornerback, maybe an edge rusher. We've talked about that, and definitely an offensive tackle. But when I was going over my board, I was like, I don't know. At this point, I think maybe, because the top 3 tackles were gone on our list. So you know what? How about a center? How about the kid from Minnesota? Do you think that would be something that the Bengals would think about, is upgrading the center position if they think they can get a guy that could be like a 10-year starter?
That's a good question, because I know that they love Ted Karras. I know the fans love Ted Karras. He's the center. He's under contract for 2 more years. The only thing is he has the ability to play both guard spots. So that's the conversation about, do you want to move Cordell Wilson back to the bench as like your 6th man and have Ted Karras play that position, or do you continue believing in Cordell Wilson making that 2nd-year jump, playing next to the guy that he played with all last year? I feel like that's probably their plan, unless they find like the second coming of Nick Mangold in the bottom of the 1st round, which I know there was a conversation last year about Tyler Linderbaum,
Absolutely.
Right? So Ted Karras was signed as the center, like that was the plan going forward, and there was a conversation regarding if Linderbaum is there, do they like him enough to just pivot off that plan and just implement him? But obviously we never saw that because he was picked with the Ravens beforehand. But even if Linderbaum was there, I'm not sold that they would have done it. And considering how well Karras kind of just immediately played, like he was by far the most consistent lineman this past year, and then the veteran leadership with everything, I feel like they want him to stick at center. There's obviously that relationship with Joe Burrow as well. So I feel like that's probably something that you could say is not going to happen.
Then let's talk about, because this was the scenario I had, was I just didn't like the fact that a lot of the top tackles were gone at that spot on our mock. So if that happens, same scenario, Does that something that or do you think the Bengals will already, of course, like every NFL team should, they're going to look at everything before free agency hits, and they're going to go, you know what? There's a possibility that we may not get a guy that we want. We need to get that guy in free agency. Do you think with the money that they have, do you see a guy out there in free agency that the Bengals could target?
So I've heard Mike McGlinchey's name, but I feel like he's going to get a decent chunk of change. And I feel like this is an offseason where you're not going to see your DJ Readers, your Trey Hendricksons, or whoever you want to name as a signing for the Bengals. I feel like the most money they're going to spend is on their own. They have a quarterback that they might need to extend here shortly, sooner or later. And his extension, Joe Burrow's, will probably impact what they can and can't do in free agency, just because that's a ton of cash that they have to give them up front, and that's going to impact, how much cash can they spend on some of these other guys. So I feel like this is the free agency where you may get at most one starter out of this free agency class, but it'll be a lot of guys who are looking for opportunities to kind of, boost their overall resume for next free agency. Maybe they didn't like what they had on the market this year, so they turn to the Bengals, who are now an established contender, and if they feel like they can get a solid role and a solid amount of play time, then maybe that's a fit. I think tackle is so interesting, though, because they love addressing that position for the future. Like you saw it in 2015 when they failed, albeit with Cedric Ogbuehi and Jake Fisher, but they drafted 2 tackles in the first 2 rounds, and they didn't start either one in 2015. So you have Jonah Williams entering the last year of his contract. You have Leo Collins coming off of a torn ACL, and they're not really financially committed to him that much beyond this year. So I feel like this is the ideal year where you take a tackle in the first 2 rounds and just
no matter what
him for a year to see.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So like, obviously you want the tackle that you won in the first round, but there's just a lot of mystery with that going forward long term. And I feel like that's really a position they're going to target.
Okay. Sounds good. So that's pretty much, because that's going to be the talk. But let's bring up Jonah Williams then. So he's definitely not lived up to his draft status. I guess safe to say that's the case. So do you think he'll be back?
So he's got one more year. It's just the 5th-year option. I feel like the evaluation is pretty much set in stone at this point. Now he's still relatively young for an incoming 5th-year player, but I feel like he would still start elsewhere in the league, and I feel like the Bengals would be fine with continuing to have him start. It sucks that you play in the AFC North and you face Myles Garrett twice a year. You face, I guess TJ Watt rushes from the other side, but the AFC North, like, they have really dominant edge rushers who know the Bengals very well. And with Jonah, the conversation's always been, is he better at guard? Is he not athletic enough? Is he not big enough? And I feel like even if you would move him inside, like, there are some limitations to his game where, like, bigger, powerful pass rushers can kind of get the best of him. And I think when it comes to, like, living up to the draft status, he was always billed as like a technician out of Alabama, and like his tape was as clean as could be, even at like 6'4", 310 pounds. And some of that technique has unfortunately has developed as much as you would have liked, which is why it can't compensate for his physical limitations. But at the end of the day, he has more very good reps than very bad reps. It's just the very bad reps look terrible because they're going up against Myles Garrett and company, who makes anyone looks like a fool. So I feel like they would still start him this year, but they would have to look at a future option at left tackle, preferably in this draft, because obviously paying left tackle starting money is a lot, and Jonah Williams is probably on the fence as whether or not he's deserving of that.
Okay, so you're thinking right now it's just going to be a wait and see approach. You don't see them giving him an extension this offseason.
Okay. No.
Okay. About some of those other young guys that you have up front. So you have Jackson Carman and you mentioned Volson. How realistic is it that those 2 guys could end up as long-term starters on the left side?
I think it's very realistic that Volson is a long-term starter. I think this year, the fact that he was replacing Carman and Quinton Spain and just this laundry list of very mediocre at best guards, it's probably elevated how much he played. The perception would be like, at the end of the day, he was still a league average guard at best, right? But the fact that he was replacing probably utter trash for the previous 4 years, it makes him look a lot better. But there is, I think, a confidence that he builds off what he did this past year. The fact that he came into the league already so experienced at 23, 24 years old, started like 60 games in North Dakota State. He already had a good foundation of acumen for playing the position, just playing offensive line in general. And I feel like he really adapted quickly. He wasn't handed anything. He earned the starting job right before week 1, and by the time October came around, he looked pretty much the part. And he had some struggles here and there, as any rookie offensive lineman does. But I feel like they're going into 2023 believing that Volson will continue to hold on to that spot. And I don't see them being that aggressive to kind of give him competition.
Okay. Outside of the offensive line, we mentioned the wide receiver situation. So really, that's just a no-brainer. There has to be added depth. And it's not just one injury. It's just, look, there's just nothing that scares you when you take a look at what's behind the top three overall. So what do you think? Maybe they add someone in free agency and then use a draft pick on a receiver. And if that happens, or vice versa, well, I guess that's vice versa. I guess it would happen that way unless you go both free agency or both draft. But how serious do you think they're going to be about using a pick on a wide receiver or tight end?
I'd say, tight ends.
Because we have to bring that into the equation, because that's part of the offensive passing game.
Yeah, they've never been shy from taking a receiver in like the second, usually the second round, maybe the third or fourth round. But that's also a position that they like to develop a year ahead of time. And they have obviously the T. Higgins question, whether or not they're going to be able to get an extension or they'll have to place the franchise tag. There's a long-term question with Tyler Boyd. I feel like this is his last year in Cincinnati as well. And they value having quality guys at all three spots. They've had that philosophy and principle since the days of Chad Johnson, T.J. Houshmandzadeh, Chris Henry back in the 2000s. So they've always tried to build a solid core to have 11 personnel with these three receivers. And I think they're going to take it seriously, replacing Tyler Boyd with a draft pick. Probably not free agency, just because I question whether or not free agents believe that they have an opportunity to shine with an expanded role, knowing that Higgins and Chase are still there. So I feel like it's going to be letting Boyd play out his contract, developing a day 2 or maybe early day 3 guy in the slot with obviously the ability to stretch the field, just because you can always use that factor as well. But they truly do need it once, or if, God forbid, they have to play an extended period without Chase or Higgins.
Okay, and it would not be a surprise if they even used up their first pick on one?
No.
Again, I'm going to throw tight end in there.
First would have to be like they have like a 1A grade.
Somebody
on like
slips.
a Jackson Smith and Jigba or something. Yeah, right. But I could definitely see tight end too, just because they have nothing under contract at that position right now. Hayden Hurst is probably going to test the market to see what he can get, but I feel like because this tight end class is so good, it's going to impact how much tight ends on the free agent market, specifically in that mid-tier, are going to be able to garner. So I feel like a Hurst reunion is likely, just because he's probably not going to get as much as he probably wants, but they have the opportunity to just build that position group however they want, and this seems like a really good draft class to do it. So if Michael Mayer or someone is in round 1 just staring them in the face, I wouldn't be surprised if they pulled the trigger.
Now, does that, though, whether Hurst gets signed or not?
Yeah, if Hurst gets signed, I wouldn't expect a round 1 pick, but again, it would have to be like the most BPA imaginable.
Okay, that makes sense. And what do you think about Hurst?
Hurst was good. I feel like they kind of still underutilized him as a vertical threat, because he just never really connected down the field as much with Joe Burrow. But a lot of yards after catch potential and production came out of him, and really a great safety valve. And there's definitely a sense that he loves being here. He loves being in the locker room. He at least felt a lot of comfortability with the scheme and his role. So I feel like there's definitely mutual interest to return, and he was solid enough. So yeah.
I mean, if you've had the career so far that Hayden Hurst has had, which has been a disappointment, and you come to Cincinnati and you've had 1 year and it was okay, and you have the opportunity to sign for whatever, another 3 or 4 years at a decent rate. Bengals have the money. I'm sure they're not going to shortchange him. Unless somebody comes around and just offers you something that you're just shocked they've offered it.
Yeah.
Why would you leave? I mean, why would you leave Joe Burrow and this program? I just can't see it. So
it's a great point, just because he knew that the potential of joining here would, whether he stays with the Bengals or not, increases obviously how much he would make on his next contract. Now, I don't foresee the Bengals matching like $8 to $10 million a year. I feel like anything under that, I feel like they'll be in the competition for.
Okay, and then the running back situation, as you mentioned. So, yeah, it's strange. The last several years, it's like it's Mixon, and then you've had Pirine. And it's like, that's it. Now, you've been lucky enough. There haven't been a lot of injuries there, so you haven't had to test. There has been, but you haven't had to test it as much as other teams. So do you think Pirine comes back?
It's 50-50 to me, just because I know that they love Joe Mixon, like the person, the leader. Obviously, there was an issue off the field a couple weeks ago, and they have to go through that process as well. But like they look at how much he's getting paid, and the fact that the production is just not matching that, which of course is universal when you're talking about running backs on second contracts. Like it's not like they haven't shied away from featuring better running backs in the past, but I feel like going forward, now that you're entering this period where money is going to cash specifically is going to be tight, and you saw how Pirine can match, if not better, the production of Joe Mixon over these past 2 years, regardless of the offensive line play. I feel like Pirine takes advantage of whatever blocking has been given to him more so than Joe Mixon, and you just have to take all that into account. Where I feel like if they go through this evaluation the correct way, they would see that re-signing Samaje Perine to a modest deal and drafting a running back sometime in the first 4 rounds is just a much more effective plan than trotting Joe Mixon out there for another year.
Okay, well, what is Mixon's status contractually?
So he's got, I believe, 2 or 3 years left, but his cap hit this year is $12 million.
And the dead money is not that bad?
No, they would have to, I think, eat up at least $3 or $4 million if they were. If they were to do like a post-June first. They normally do pre-June 1st cuts. They don't like to have dead money for multiple years, but they can make an exception here.
Interesting. Oh, this is why I love having you on. This isn't anything that I expected, but in a way, it does. I completely understand where you're coming from, and it does make sense. By the way, as far as some backups, we mentioned one of them. Will Brandon Allen be back?
I've always thought that when Joe Burrow gets paid, it's the time to just draft a quarterback to just groom under him, but
number 2.
Yeah, so like that would make sense this year, but I could always see Brandon Allen coming back.
And even signing him, I'm sure it'll be a small enough contract that if you find the right guy in the draft, you could still add him to the roster anyway.
Exactly.
Okay. Defensively, so we talked about the edge rush, and we've talked about Asai a lot because this was a guy that I liked coming out of college. Thought that he would make an imprint. The injury obviously came, and we talked about that. This year, as you said, showed some progress. We understand how the season ended. It's not the way you want the season to end. But overall, is he heading in the right direction?
Definitely. I feel like, unfortunately for him, he was almost used in the beginning of the season as like a backup 3 technique just because they didn't have that spark behind BJ Hill, and I feel like that's an underrated need going forward. Is just like a pass rushing defensive tackle that they can rotate in with these guys, because once you have that, then you can just leave Asai on the edge, where I feel like that's just better for him. I don't see him having a bunch of success just being a battering ram to some of these guards on third down. Leave him on the edge where he did eventually thrive towards the end of the season. Like obviously everyone's going to talk about the second Chiefs game. The first Chiefs game, he arguably made the most important play. He sacked Patrick Mahomes and forced a 55-yard field goal that the Chiefs missed, and unfortunately they couldn't score after that. So he eventually started to thrive once they left him more on the edge and on the outside. So I feel like if they keep him in that role, they find some more help to the inside so they don't have to move him around that much. I feel like he'll continue to grow.
Really, as far as pass rushing is, you believe that the way the team is set up is they could really just concentrate on an interior defensive tackle, pass rusher, then they'd be fine.
They would be fine. Like you could always use another edge. Like I think after Asai, there's definitely a drop off. Like Cam Sample, I feel like is a decent player, but he doesn't give you that juice that Asai does. And beyond him, like you basically have nothing. Okay. So if Trey Hendrickson actually misses extended period of time, you don't want Sam Hubbard to be your best, most consistent edge rusher for sure.
Now we talked about the draft pick Zach Carter last year. I mentioned to you that he was one of my most like polarizing early picks. Didn't really like him in the third round. Thought he was a little overrated. Didn't think though that meant that he couldn't find the right scheme and find the right fit and become a good serviceable player. But when you draft a guy in the third round, I think you want to be more than serviceable. So do you think, from what you've seen, do you think that whatever they saw in him and with the team, with the coordinator, that he's a good long-term part of this defense?
I would say he's here for the rest of his contract. Beyond that, it's obviously up in the air. I feel like he's he's not what I'm personally looking for as as a rotational pass rusher. I feel like he definitely made improvements against the run this year, and I feel like that was probably the goal for him. Just find the ball, shed some blocks, and make some plays at the line. And he eventually started to do that more consistently as the year went on. But I just don't really know what he is as an athlete, as a defensive tackle. He just doesn't provide that much of a get off. And again, maybe that wasn't the priority for him this season, and maybe he makes some type of a minor jump, but I just don't really foresee him being that 5-6 sack guy that you can get 50% playing time throughout the year. So I feel like his presence shouldn't impact whether or not they attack a true 3 technique going forward.
Okay, now at linebacker, Jermaine Pratt, one of the big stories for the defense this season. Boy, coincidence, this is free agent year. You hope it's not a coincidence, but what about that? The team has the money, so how big of a jump did he actually have?
It's interesting because you look at the PFF grades and oh my God, this guy's the best coverage linebacker in the game. And he definitely made a lot of very timely plays. Whenever you needed a turnover, he was probably the guy that would pry after the ball. He had that moment against the Chiefs. So he made a lot of timely plays, but he wasn't used that much in coverage to the point where his ability wasn't being stressed that much as Logan Wilson, for example. And the Bengals, I feel like, have already made their case that Logan Wilson is our true Mike 3-down linebacker, and that's probably the guy that will pay. Speaking for the Bengals here, rather than Jermaine Pratt, who's more, I don't want to say situational because I feel like that's kind of demeaning, but he wasn't being trusted as much in some situations as Logan Wilson was. So for a team that doesn't historically pay linebackers, they probably do value Logan Wilson as a long-term option in that sense, and they would extend him. They would probably look to extend him this offseason if they can. And I feel like with Pratt, it would make sense if the franchise tag was a lot lower, but it's near $20 million, and the Bengals just aren't touching that. So it's going to be a situation where, hey, go test the market, get paid if you can, but if not, we might have an offer for you that's probably considerably less than what he's looking for, and that's just how it's going to go.
So again, sort of like Hurst. So somebody gives him some sort of inflated contract offer, he's going to go. Okay.
Yeah.
But so what was his primary position then? Because again, I know the team doesn't play a whole lot of linebackers with their schemes. So of course we mentioned Wilson, and we've talked a lot about Wilson the last few years because he's another guy that I actually loved coming out of college. And I know things didn't work out for him his rookie season, but he's been just awesome the last couple of years. And I know he's going to get better. I mean, I'm awesome, but you know what I mean. But how do they fit to the defense? So like you said, Wilson's the Mike, and where do they usually Pratt? What's his main responsibility?
I mean, he was just the will, right? He was just the other linebacker in their 5-2. So they'll have obviously Hendrickson and Hubbard. When in their true base defense, they'll have them as off ball or off 2-point stance edges. So you can't even talk today. And they'll just have Pratt and Wilson play next to each other, and then they'll have some type of created third down packages, and they might take Pratt off the field. They might have Hubbard lining up next to Logan Wilson. And it's just a lot of weird creative stuff that Lunaruma was doing, and they put Pratt in a lot of very advantageous situations for him to utilize that skill set. But yeah, going forward, I don't think it's probably worth what he's going to get on the market, at least from the Bengals.
And if he does wind up leaving, do they have someone that they could replace him with on the roster, or is that definitely going to be a need?
Yeah, so they drafted 2 other guys along with Wilson back in 2020. I feel like they love who Akeem Davis-Gaither is, and they probably want to get him on the field a little bit obviously of a leaner player compared to Pratt. And you might see a drop off in terms of filling run fits and all that stuff. But I feel like he would probably get an expanded role. Maybe you see more of Marcus Bailey as well, who's mainly been on special teams for the past 2 years, but he hasn't had a bunch of injury issues like he had in college. So I feel like now's the time to get him on the field a little bit more. Third round is usually when they draft linebackers for the future, so I would probably pinpoint that round. If they were to draft a linebacker, it might be in that round just for the long term.
Again, it's not a major important piece of the defense, not like the secondary. So. And this is something we touched up on, obviously, before the season began. And you told me at the time that you did not believe Bates would return. Do you still feel that way?
Yeah, I feel like it's 1% at this point. He's the ultimate, I'm sure Bengals fans have a mixed opinion on Bates and how much he's actually worth and how good of a season that he had. His skill set is still very highly valued around the league, and teams are still looking for that that free safety with the range that he has and the ability to be a leader on the defense, just kind of make everything click. So he's already had dinner with like Falcons players and everything. So like interest is there around the league, and odds are he's going to get a deal that is at least resembles what he wanted last year, what he wanted 2 years ago, and what he probably still wants now. He's still young enough to, make bank and potentially be the highest paid safety in the league. And I feel like there's going to be one team that does that, and the Bengals just, like, they've already planted their feet. So we're probably not comfortable giving you the guaranteed money that you want or the money up front that you want. But if you find that elsewhere, we wish you luck and have a good career.
And do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think I do, just because they already have the plan in place. Like, they drafted Dax Hill knowing that at least one of Bates or Von Bell was going to leave this year. I love the ability that Dax Hill has. He showed it a lot in the preseason. They couldn't really find a consistent role for him in the regular season. A lot of people believed that they were going to roll out some 3 safety sets, but that didn't really happen. So I'm excited to see Dax Hill in a finalized, stable role where he has, specific duties, and he's not all over the secondary trying to speak 3 languages at once. So I'm excited to see how he can grow in potentially just one position, and I love the range and the skill set that he has to potentially replace.
And what
Bates.
about Bell? What is your feeling on if Bates does leave? Do you think Bell then gets re-signed?
I would say it's probably like 75% that Bell gets re-signed. Now, again, if a team wants to pay him a ton, I'm sure they're not going to move that much off their price point, but I kind of view it as the Larry Ogunjobi, BJ Hill situation from last year. Larry Ogunjobi signed a very lucrative deal with the Chicago Bears. The Bengals kind of accepted that. Unfortunately for Larry Ogunjobi, the medical didn't go through, so he didn't end up going to the Bears, but they then turned their full attention to BJ Hill. I don't know this for a fact, but I believe that they kind of upped the offer a little bit just because they had more cash to work with because they didn't re-sign Larry Ogunjobi, so they ended up re-signing BJ Hill. And I feel like something similar is going to happen with Von Bell, where they probably have an offer for him or being drafted at this moment. Once Bates moves on in free agency, they'll fully focus on Bell. They don't want to replace both guys in one offseason, so they'll say, hey, we're going to give you a little bit more now that we have some wiggle room to work with, but we want you back.
Okay, makes sense. At corner, so Eli Apple, he's like you mentioned what they did last year in the draft with Hill. Looking ahead, lose Bates, move Hill in. Is that after seeing one season of Taylor Britt drafting him? Is that what they're going to do, letting Apple go?
Yeah, that's probably what's going to happen. My thing is, I don't see a ton of interest for Apple outside of Cincinnati for some obvious reasons. So I could see it being like sometime in May or June, if he's still around, like might as well bring him back as like the 4th guy just because he knows the team and everything. But last year, it seemed like it was going to be an open competition between Taylor Britt and Apple, but that wasn't the case. And unfortunately, Taylor Britt got hurt in the preseason, so that was really out of the equation. But now it's like, okay, Taylor Britt has shown enough as a starter. He's going into his 2nd year. He's fully healthy. He's the starter in pencil right now, opposite of Chidobe Awuzie. But unfortunately, Awuzie, like Leo Collins, has a torn ACL. So I could also see they love drafting cornerbacks historically in the 1st round. Awuzie only has 1 year left on his deal, and outside of him, like obviously Taylor Britt's your only other starting healthy cornerback under contract. It's definitely a position that they could look for early in the draft.
That's why I said when I was going over my mock, that was it. It's like, all right, cornerback, edge, and then offensive line obviously is the big one. But yeah, that does make a lot of sense. And it's a deep enough class as well at corner that Bengals could end up with a really good player in the 1st round. It might even be the way they go if they're like me and they're like, yeah, you know what, not really happy with how the offensive tackles fell to us. Let's go after this corner who sticks out and makes a lot more sense early. So anybody else on in the secondary, any of these young players, anybody that we didn't talk about that you think we should keep an eye on?
Tyson Anderson was their 5th round pick last year out of Toledo. He was a safety, but he didn't play at all. He got injured late in the preseason and was basically redshirted. He would probably fill in as like the 3rd safety, more of like a special teams guy, but I could see him getting rotated in with the defense. Again, it's a big unknown with what that safety group is going to look like with both of those starters entering free agency. You don't know for sure which position Dax Hill is going to play. And Tyson Anderson was really loved by this team coming out of college. They were really excited about it, taking him in the 5th. He's everything that they look for as a person and just as a teammate. So I'm excited to see what role he kind of carves out because he was looking kind of promising towards the end of the preseason.
Okay. A few more things before I let you go. So I see that do you have both main returners free agents? Will they need to bring someone in, or is that a position, or are those positions that they already have pretty much locked up on the team no matter what happens with Trent Taylor or Travion Williams?
Yeah, so Travion Williams is a free agent, and Trent Taylor is also a free agent. So both those guys, I could see Taylor being brought back just because he's pretty reliable. But with Travion, I could see him being brought back too. But again, like those would be re-signings where like it doesn't impact what you do afterwards. You know,
so, but and right now neither one of those guys are like impact players, so that's also something that they could look to improve. Okay.
Yeah.
As far as I know, this is one of the teams that doesn't necessarily have like a general manager type. We've talked about that a lot. So just to make sure we're on the same page again for another draft season, Duke Tobin, is he the main guy there? Again, is he the dude that is basically calling most of the shots regarding the draft?
Yeah, it's been that way for well beyond 10 years now, I would say. But again, like they don't have titles there in Paycor Stadium. I almost said Paul Brown Stadium.
Good to know. Yeah. All right, and then also as you mentioned, you think Logan Wilson could get extended, DJ Reader as well?
That's a good question. I believe Reader is closing in on 30, which probably I would lean towards no. But again, like if he continues to dominate at that spot, like they already love him as a leader and as a captain and everything, I wouldn't rule it out completely. But just because he's probably more closer to 30 than they would feel comfortable with, I would lean towards no.
Okay, and then if they do not use money on a McGlinchey type, which you're saying you don't think they're going to do, give me your best guess on a position that you think will be the most impactful financially in free agency.
It's a great question. They don't have a ton of holes, at least in terms of the starting lineup outside of, you have tight end, you have cornerback, but again, that's Taylor Britt's job. Safety, that's one of Dax Hill's jobs. And linebacker, which I would feel like they probably wouldn't sign a veteran starter there. So maybe it might be tight end, just because I can't see like a position where like a starter's coming in and being like a full-time starter or full-time player at that spot. So I don't see this being like a particularly active free agency period for this team. It might resemble what the free agencies of the past before 2020 were for the Bengals, but hopefully you're adding like actual quality guys and not bad players for just no money.
And then lastly, so again, McGlinchey thing and the offensive line, that is we kind of started that way, and I'm sure everybody's going to start a conversation with you regarding the offensive line, but yeah, it just, from the outside perspective, you could see why any outside observer would be like, well, wait a second, look at all the money they have. They have a clear need at tackle. Well, why wouldn't they spend money on the top offensive tackle, whoever they feel that is in free agency? And is that because you believe that, like you said, they're going to have to pay Burrow and that's coming up, that you just don't think that either they're going to have the money that they feel it's going to be worth it?
So the money thing is interesting because like they're going to break historical trends with signing Joe Burrow and potentially T. Higgins. Like those contracts will not look like anything that the Bengals have done in the past, which means that they can be more flexible with putting the big cap hits in the back of the contract. So they could have space to do that with a Mike McGlinchey, but it comes down to they still have never really paid that much for a tackle on the open market. Like Andrew Whitworth, what he got with the Bengals is still, I think, the most expensive thing or contract that a tackle has ever gotten with the Bengals. So it still comes down to historical trends for me.
Fair enough.
And like Alex Kappa, like the highest paid offensive lineman in Bengals history, it's it's a pretty average stuff what you see at the top of the market deals. So yeah,
it'd be interesting because again, because that's really what I wanted to hear you say, because it's not that, because I'm a trend guy myself, and until I see that trend break for the first time, I can see why you're going to say, yeah, I just don't see it. But it's not going to be a surprise, of course, if it happens. I don't think anybody's going to be surprised if it happens, and I think Bengal fans would probably be real happy if that happens. But look, this team has been really close the last couple of years with very mediocre play along that offensive line. And if they just get a little bit better depth, maybe even, they should be okay. And I'll tell you what, even in that game against the Chiefs, as much as they could have been better, of course, and Chris Jones was just a monster, the fact is, it still wasn't as bad as the offensive line looked the first couple of weeks of the season. I mean, that was just a disaster.
Yeah,
that wasn't even, that was bad. So I think their offensive line actually wasn't really as bad as it could have been. And I still think that there were, opportunities, obviously, for them to win that football game, even with what they had on the field. So
that game is much different if they have a healthy offensive line, for sure. Like it was absolutely clicking towards the end of the season. But yeah, that AFC Championship game, it definitely looked like this looks a lot like weeks 1 and 2 when Burrow was sacked a combined 13 times in those games, and it just wasn't enough.
Yeah, it is what it is, but that's the whole deal. That's why when you take a look at the teams that were in the Super Bowl, especially the Eagles, you look at their injury list, and it's not there. Everybody's healthy, and you have to be healthy at that time of the year, and the Bengals just weren't. But again, you got Joe Burrow. That's going to be something, as we said in the beginning, that is going to work for the franchise moving forward. He's going to win a Super Bowl. He's probably going to win multiple. I just don't think there's any doubt about that. And we'll talk more about that, of course, hopefully maybe at some point in the next few months, either before or right after the draft. So for Bengals fans out there, you got a podcast, like a regular show that you do?
Yeah, so me and my co-host Anthony Cosenza for Cincy Jungle, we do the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. And you can find that wherever you get your podcasts, searching under just the Cincy Jungle Podcast Network.
Awesome. John, appreciate it. Great job as always. We'll talk to you again sometime soon.
Thanks, Greg.